a new comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership.
They call it the TPP. Canada reaches a key trade deal with 10 nations. The United States is not among them. The government of Canada is touting that new Trans-Pacific Partnership as the right deal. The Minister of International Trade says it's good for our economy. He says it will sustain growth, that it will create jobs for our middle class. That coming from François-Philippe Champagne. But my next guest says, hold on a minute. He's waiting for the final details of the deal. The national president of Canada's largest private sector union says it could be damaging. It could even destroy Canada's auto industry. Jerry Diaz is the national president of Unifor. He joins me live from Montreal. Jerry, I thought nothing could destroy Canada's auto industry. How do you see this one sort of taking little chunks of it away?
Well, first of all, there has to be some major modifications to the original TPP. And I think what I'm really frustrated about is I met with Minister Champagne for almost an hour yesterday, and he never mentioned at all that they were on the cusp of a deal. As a matter of fact, I raised the challenges with the auto industry. I raised the fact that in the original TPP, they lowered the rules of origin, which would have led to about 24,000 layoffs in the industry. I talked about the fact that the United States had negotiated that the Japanese tariffs would come off between 25 and 30 years, yet Canada folded. The tariffs would come off after 5 years. We talked about the labor standards in the TPP being non-enforceable. We talked about how it would undermine everything we're trying to accomplish here in Montreal with NAFTA. So until I see the text, and unless somebody tells me that they made significant inroads in the contentious issues, then we have a real problem here.
I want to just leave NAFTA for a little bit later in our discussion, but let's talk about some of the bilateral agreements that have been made within TPP. For example, Canada, Japan, they've agreed to resolve non-tariff barriers. There's also a binding settlement mechanism for disputes. There is a bilateral agreement with Malaysia to adjust the rules of origin for autos. There's one coming with Australia. I believe New Zealand might be on that list as well. Does all of that not together sort of act as a salve, if you will?
No, first of all, Malaysia, New Zealand, they don't have an auto industry. It's Japan. So have they adjusted what the original language was on rules of origin for Japan? Because that's where the problem is. It's not with Malaysia or New Zealand. But the key issues become, yes, did they put into place the equivalent of Chapter 19 with NAFTA? I would expect yes, because it's important that we have a dispute mechanism. So some of the things I'm sure that are in place are fine. But it's hardly a progressive trade agenda when it's going to once again slap the auto industry. Ford, GM, and Chrysler were furious over the original TPP. Why? Because once again, it's about allowing the Japanese more access to our market and us having none to theirs. They ship 600 cars to Canada for every one we ship back. The Japanese automakers were celebrating the original TPP because it would be cheaper for them to build a car in Japan with non-TPP parts, mainly from China, and ship the finished product to the North American market, therefore undermining what they have here in Canada.
So if you're saying that, you know, auto trade with Malaysia, with the one car you're talking about, and I know you're being facetious, but I suppose in some sense, when you look at the trade with the United States, it isn't being facetious. That kind of stuff doesn't matter. What really matters is the U.S. So let's talk about timing. Here we are, the Prime Minister is about to make his keynote address in Davos in front of all of those elite world leaders, et cetera, economic leaders, and he comes out and says Canada has agreed to the new Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think they call it the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement. So add a couple of initials before that. But he comes out and says that, seeming like a real coup. And in terms of timing with NAFTA, we know that those discussions are going on. What does that mean for you?
Well, NAFTA is 24% of the world's GDP. So the concentration should be on NAFTA. And the last thing in the world you should do is do anything to undermine it. If, in fact, they agree to the original labor standards language in TPP, that means they completely destroyed everything the Canadian team is trying to accomplish here as it relates to the labor standards in Mexico. Mexico in NAFTA, I mean, minimum wage is 65 cents an hour. Pre-NAFTA, we had a trade surplus in manufacturing. Today, we have a $120 billion deficit. They've closed 4 auto plants in Canada. They closed 10 in the United States. They've opened 8 in Mexico. They're opening a BMW plant next year where they're going to make $1.10 an hour. If they agree to the same labor standards that was in the original TPP, they just torpedoed everything they're trying to accomplish here.
We'll certainly be watching to see what the Minister, François-Philippe Champagne, has to say. I know you've had personal discussions with him, but we'll be watching for further reaction. Jerry, I want to thank you for your time. We're on it.
Pleasure is always mine.
Jerry Dias is the national president of Unifor. That is the largest private sector union in Canada.